Hello, my name is Kevin Lothridge, and I'm the Executive Director at the National Forensic Science Technology Center at Florida International University. I'm here to moderate today's session with our subject matter experts and dealing with forensic science during COVID-19. Go ahead, Gaille.
My name is Gaille MacKinnon. I'm a lead forensic archaeologist with Alecto Forensics, a forensic science company in the United Kingdom. And I specialize in disaster victim identification and mass fatalities.
I'm Tracy Alexander. I'm the Director of Forensic Services for the City of London Police, and I have a special responsibility for mass fatalities, mortuary organisation and disaster victim identification.
Hi, I'm Marwan Khoury. I finished my PhD this year from the University of Leicester, came back to Lebanon, where I'm currently residing. My specialty is in forensic DNA, although my interests are to expand a bit more generalist towards thinking about the gap that we have in this region with regards to decision-making in criminal justice.
Well, thank you, everyone. Today's format will be a question and answer session where each panelist will answer a question based on their knowledge, training, and experience, as well as the current new normal as forensic science goes in the times of COVID-19. The first series of questions that I would like to address is, what are the change in crime patterns that each of you are seeing, or what your countries are projecting to be the change in crime patterns that we may not have thought of in our normal operations, that way we did business? So, Gaille?
I think certainly from my perspective in the United Kingdom, our crime attendance has not changed really. In fact, you know, we are as busy as we normally are with crime scene attendance, less so post-mortem examination attendance, but it's certainly true to say that we expect post-COVID to start looking for missing people. So the situation here in the United Kingdom with a stringent lockdown is such that I'm sure that Tracy can tell you there's a rise in domestic abuse, but there's certainly, I think there'll be an opportunity to and a request to look for missing people post-lockdown that may have come to harm during the lockdown period.
Tracy, would you like to follow up with your observations?
Yeah, Gaille's absolutely right. We have seen a rise in domestic abuse. We haven't seen very much of our usual crime types. We expect that once we're released from lockdown, which will probably be in some part next week, that we'll have a lot of reports of burglaries from non-residential properties. We just don't know who's been broken into at the moment. City of London Police is the lead force for fraud, and there's certainly been a massive amount of online fraud. There have been people trying to sell PPE, for example, to all sorts of scared people and to the emergency services also. The lowering crime rate has helped us because it means we've been able to put police resources into going out to community deaths, because, as Gaille said, we suspect that some people might be using the opportunity of the pandemic in order to finish off an aged aunt that they haven't wanted around for a while. So we are sending out an emergency response to that with a police officer, detective and forensic expert in order to be able to assess those deaths in the community where the person hasn't seen a doctor in the last 28 days. So although the family might be suggesting that they've died as a result of COVID, we are checking that out.
Mm-hmm.
Very, very good. Marwan?
If I wanted to basically divide the crime patterns that I would suspect to be on the rise, it would be, as previously said, domestic violence, and as previously said, cyber criminality. I would add to that some reports of fraudulent applications that would tell you they do something such as tracing the people around you that might be infected, but actually what it is intended for is to take some private information from you, and you know, all this fraudulent ransomware stuff. And then I would say, I don't know if you would agree with me with regards to the huge amount of disinformation that is being spread around the COVID-19 itself, that is also kind of bringing some dangerous consequences with regards to society and how people are behaving and or complying or not with the regulations. Now, with regards to Lebanon, there are two statistics that were published online from the police. The first one is a rise in harassment, which is part of the cyber criminality. So basically, it's harassment due to people who have been exposed themselves in video or photos. Then the other statistic that they published is a decline. It's not really crime, but it's a decline in road accidents and a decline in injuries and deaths from road accidents, for sure.
And in the U.S., we've had this very similar issues. I know that Gaille's talked to some of her colleagues in the U.S., and I can say that road accidents are down. Speeding is up, though. People are realizing that they can drive faster because there's less cars. In my own neighborhood, we had an incident related to COVID-19, which was broadcast to be a incident where the law enforcement was called to say that a father killed his father and his son shot him because they were not social distancing. Total fake. It was a term swatting here in the U.S. where they called and said all this. But of course, if you're in a small neighborhood, people are wondering why the police force are responding to something that could be a horrendous crime when it's not. And so those things are on the rise, I believe, and it's something different. We've had to deal with those things in the past, but I think it would be nice to hear from the folks about some of the discussions they've had with their international colleagues. Gaille, I know you were talking to folks here in the U.S. and trying to compare the processes. It would be great to hear from you about that.
Well, I think I have colleagues and friends in New York who are in the medical examiner system, and I think that a little like the London response that, excuse me, Tracy is talking about is teams going out, medical legal investigation and detective and emergency service personnel to look at community deaths. So similar to Tracy's description, it's going on certainly in New York. My friend is in Queens and coordinating that response. And so it's very different. The deaths are not being brought into the medical examiner's office. And perhaps Tracy can talk a bit more about that, what's happening in London, but certainly, you know, those assessments are made on the ground in a domestic residence or in the place of death. And those bodies are then, of the victims are being transported to a holding facility, whether that's at the ME's office or in the mortuary or the funeral directors. So it is bypassing the system, and certainly in this country that's what's happening under the jurisdiction of the coroner, of course, and the attending police force. But I think the approach is the same. Would you agree, Tracy?
Yeah, pretty similar. So how it's working here is that we have the initial call to the ambulance service, and that ambulance service has an automatic response to the question, is the patient alive and breathing? If the answer is no, then an ambulance is dispatched automatically. And we've tried all sorts of ways to see if we could stop that happening, and you just can't. And to a certain extent, maybe you would want to. So that ambulance is already going, but we were trying to take the pressure off the ambulance service and the NHS, also local GPs and the coronial system. So what happens once the ambulance has been dispatched is that the call operator takes details, as in, you know, were they symptomatic? Have they been to hospital recently? Have they had a test? Have they had a spiking temperature? And go through a list of questions. If they then have reason to think, right, this sounds very much like a COVID case, that call is transferred into command and control in the police, and then the police will dispatch one of our multi-agency response cars, and that car has a competent clinician, it has a detective, and it has the forensic investigator, or some kind of skill set that will match all of those. So the ambulance crew has been there, and if there is obviously savable life, then they'll go through those processes as usual. If that person is definitely dead, then the multi-agency response car has the clinician to pronounce life extinct. The police team are then checking that there are no signs of injury, that the scene looks appropriate to the descriptions that we've had from the family. They're making some questions with the next of kin and so on. And then if they are content that there's no suspicious circumstances, they're then wrapping the body appropriately and cleaning the outside, so obstructing the airway, wrapping the body so that it's then safe for the rest of the family who might have been kept separate from the deceased for some time. So everybody could then say their farewells once that body's appropriately wrapped, and then they're left to be collected by the undertaker to be taken to a facility or to a community mortuary or wherever is appropriate. But the death certificate is being signed by a remote hub of general practitioners, which is exploiting some new legislation which was brought in specifically for this response. But in very rare circumstances is the deceased going into the coronial process. Obviously they will if they've died alone, so there's nobody to say whether they were symptomatic or what might have happened to them beforehand. If they're very decomposed, because then it would be difficult for us to say just by being there and having a quick look to say whether there were any signs of force or trauma or neglect or anything else that might require further investigation.
I can tell you in the U.S. on some of these case acceptance is very interesting. I think the way that Tracy, you and Gaille have laid it out, there's some other things in the conventional forensic lab that we're seeing that may or may not change back to the way it used to be. So there's been, some unchanged principles or practices. Cases are still going on. That's fine. But they're also noticing that some of the customers, the law enforcement agencies, are doing other types of work, therefore they're noticing a decline in evidence submissions, but that doesn't mean that they're not being collected. It just means they're not being brought to the laboratory at this time. So there's a chance that when we always talk in forensic science, there's no good news story about backlogs. Now there's a chance that we could get to a place where we are almost current. I won't say caught up, but almost current. And then an onslaught of cases could push you over the breaking point. I also have been having discussions about what are we going to do about the persistence potentially of COVID-19, because we don't necessarily have all the analytical data we would like on non-porous surfaces and things that have been stored. So the labs are still going to have a need for additional PPE that we always use anyway. So it's normal practices. It's just to be mindful, just like in the early days of other epidemics that become problematic. Marwan, did you have anything that you wanted to add, or
I could give a small glimpse into the Lebanese state of affairs with regards to management of the death. So in terms of numbers, we're a small country, like around 5.5 billion population, and the confirmed cases positive are 750 only. We have 25 deaths that were directly linked to COVID-19. And the total RT-PCR tests that were made were around 28,000. Okay, so these are the numbers. It's not so. As I was speaking to some people here in the police, I can't really mention which specific force it is, but things have not changed drastically in terms of management of the dead. We have 25 confirmed cases. The other problem that I heard was a case of trying to repatriate a dead person that was in Ivory Coast. So we have a large diaspora of Lebanese people abroad, and especially in Africa. So we have a case of a person that died from the virus, but the family was not able to repatriate the body, and they're still there. He's still there. He's buried there, and that was a big, problem for the family itself.
I'd like to throw this next topic out there, because I know when we've talked in the past, it was one that we spent a lot of time on, and it's about supplies, consumables, and the supply chain. Gaille, do you want to start us out, and then we'll go to Tracy and then to Marwan?
Well, in terms of supplies for us as a company, we're all supplied up because we regularly order. So in terms of, we're not in the position where we can donate surplus, but because we do a lot of training and it's always in PPE, we're okay. But I know that that's not the case for a number of people who attend crime scenes. And I imagine the other forensic service providers in this country, as time goes on, it will be more problematic to get the types of masks that we require for different types of scenes. At the moment, we're okay, but I do think that that will change if this goes on for an extended period of time, because of course you have the responders from the NHS who are the frontline staff, and you know, the cases that we're attending are missing people, vulnerable people, deaths out in the community, but with a suspicious element to it. So at the moment, I think we're yet encountering potential COVID cases, but that's going to change. So I think it's an ever-changing landscape in terms of PPE for us. Yeah.
Tracy, I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, it was an interesting few weeks. So obviously we keep ourselves fairly well stocked for our general crime scene responses, and also should we have a mass fatality. But you can't keep it forever because it goes out of date, and we're rather short of cash. We're perpetually short of cash in policing, so we can't just buy stuff to keep it just in case, because we haven't got money to spend on our regular requirements for operational policing. Everything that was available was immediately diverted to the NHS, which is absolutely fine and right and proper. But it did make it rather difficult to try to get hold of anything. Fortunately, the NHS were quite aware that we're trying to provide a response that would keep people out of hospital, or certainly keep them out of hospital mortuaries, which got 80–90% full really quickly. So they wanted us to be able to perform this function in the community. So we were just swapping stuff, taking them. They ran out of body bags, so we were giving them the sheeting wrap that we would use to wrap bodies in a mass fatality incident, and they were swapping us with masks. We had fabulous discussions about what one might call an appropriate mask. So I had a long conversation with lots of people, as in, I never want to hear FP2 or KN95 or anything else ever again. It's like Hoover, vacuum, Dyson. It needs to perform a function. Is it fluid repellent? Yes, great. We'll have 2,000 of those. Thanks very much. But it was interesting. But bartering and swapping was definitely the way to go. And it's also the aftermath as well, because nobody's paid for any of this stuff. We've just had tons and tons of things come in. I don't have the budget for it, but at some point somebody's going to have to pay the suppliers, because otherwise those companies will go bust. But the arguments that we've had here are, well, if you buy things for policing, then you have to pay for it out of a police budget. It's not a police function to cope with deaths in the community. It's a local authority responsibility. It's a legal responsibility. So if we've done the job that you weren't able to do, I suggest the least you could do is give us the cash for it.
Very good. Marwan?
I think there was an emotional part of me that was saying, let's give everything we have in stock to the people on the front lines, the doctors, the nurses, all the medical and paramedical personnel. But then I saw some videos here in the region of people having to do policing jobs without any PPE, which is very bad for everyone. So I also spoke to some police forces here, and they seem not to be very worried. One is because the stock is quite big. So as Tracy was saying, I'm not saying that it is forever, or if there's a second wave, then we won't have a problem. Now, the good news is I always thought that Lebanon in particular as a country would be reliant on exporting all the material, which is partly true. But one of the things is that there's a company that started mass production of masks and gloves that are quite reliable. So we have an internal production. In terms of budget, I don't have any information with regards to that. The response in the country was very much everybody was kind of trying to work together for us to fight this. I'm not sure if the police forces will have to pay for the PPE in case they need it. At the moment, they don't need it. And one thing as well is the army as well started to produce their own masks. Now these are the washable triple layered masks, and I'm not sure how efficient these would be. I could probably ask Gaille or Tracy or you, Kevin, about that.
Well, I think something is better than nothing in some of these cases. It depends on what they're doing. We can argue mask, as long as it keeps out liquids, you're probably okay. One of the things that we've seen here in talking with the local forensic labs internationally as well is we did have a stock, just like Gaille said. We had, it's not like we could give it away because we had a stock for doing normal work. Now, we're a training facility, and we did have some extra gloves and masks that we provided to first responders, not hospital, not medical people, but law enforcement firefighters, just to make sure that they had nitrile gloves and some at least surgical masks. We have seen a large population of people changing production. So we've got local companies that are converting from packaging companies to making shields because they can cut Lexan and put a Velcro strip on them. I think, much like you said, Marwan, everybody's looking to make sure that they're going to ensure at least some level of production. If you watch anything about the U.S., we're on there talking about making N95 mask and things like that. The challenge is we had offshored almost 80% of the production of that. There's also, as Tracy and I were joking yesterday, we don't need to have another discussion about what mask is right. But the other thing is, what barrier material is correct? It depends on what the job is the people are doing. The frontline healthcare workers need different things than people who are taking temperatures from people in vehicles. So I think from a forensic science standpoint, it's about attending crime scenes or doing your normal post-mortem medical examiner anthropological job, that you know what you need and you have normal supply chains. It's just when everybody tries to buy it. The other thing we've seen is the normal systems we were using, the price has increased by those vendors. Probably not anything bad, but it probably cost them more to get the material themselves. So again, you have to think about that. I now want to switch over to something that we all are using, new and different ways of communication, much like this webinar. I'd like to hear from Gaille, Tracy, and then Marwan about what types of systems have you used? Are they good? Are they bad? Are they great? So, Gaille?
Well, internally that we have, our staff are all working from home unless they're specifically called to crime scenes or examinations in the laboratory. We have at least twice weekly Teams meeting on Microsoft, Zoom meetings if we require a secure, really secure connection for our defense and security work, and a rotation of going into the office and into the laboratory on a one-person only basis, and cleaning as you go in and cleaning as you go out to ensure everyone's safety. And certainly that's working, and it's a very different way of working. So everything is done peer review and fact and admin and administration of reports. Everything is done remotely between our team. And it is definitely a new way of working. There's no question about that. And I think it's becoming more and more efficient as we get better and better at doing these things remotely, but it certainly doesn't take the place of a face-to-face review if you've got a very large case that several people have to review at the same time. So that's still going to be a challenge, I think, and we're going to have to find creative ways to work around that. But certainly in terms of attending crime scenes, sometimes we have to travel together. And there is no two ways about that. And then we have to very carefully select who's going to go, whose expertise and experience is required for that particular attendance, and assess the risk that would be. But because everyone is self-isolating at home and we know what's going on a daily basis, we're less concerned than we would be in a really large company, but it's still quite tricky to negotiate. Yeah.
Tracy?
We're a bit stuck, really, as in we don't have great bandwidth. So Teams takes up quite a lot of bandwidth, so that's a bit of a non-starter. Yeah, most people have just stuck Zoom on their own phone, on their iPhone, like their personal one, because you can get 40 minutes for free. But personally, I don't think any meeting should take longer than 40 minutes anyway, so it's been absolutely fine.
Okay, and Marwan?
With regards to communication, so I'm not working in any police force or forensic science laboratory for this problem, but I was thinking about it, and what I'd like to see is a means of communication, if you guys can propose one, that can send files, reports, have a video conference where the client or the police force with which we're working with would be confident that all the material would be safe. So I was looking into how to send emails in the safest way possible. Do I really need to have a server and kind of own the whole communication? But also with regards to traveling to crime scene as well, here my discussions with the people was that the personnel was reduced, whether it is in the lab or going to the crime scene. In terms of case acceptance, they don't have the choice, so all cases would be accepted. But whenever, so there would be an internal discussion. If before there would be 5 people that would go to this type of crime scene, if 2 can handle it, now it's only 2 that go there. Yeah, and now with regards to the system here of how to transmit the information from the police forces, so where the investigation is taking place, to the judicial body. So there's like a report that should be transmitted. Here it's still in a hard copy, so I'm not sure in the UK how it is, but the investigation happens inside the lab. Then there's a report that is written, and this hard copy would be transmitted to the judge. If there's any lawyer that needs to look at it, they can only take a look at the final report itself and not come to the laboratory where the investigation happened.
Yeah, and I from the communication standpoint, I don't think there's any one good answer. If you're worried about secure communications, you can certainly encrypt and decrypt your emails or use cloud-based services that require dual authentication. There's ways to do that. What we've seen is practices have changed. So things that were not allowed before, almost overnight became allowable. So if you had hard copies, they became electronic copies. If you couldn't review the data files from outside the facility, you could. So we've all talked a little bit about scheduling and staffing of people. We're seeing the same thing. People come in different hours of the day, clean on the way in, clean on the way out, generate a large amount of data, then go some other place and review that data and have it reviewed. So I think as we go forward, the interesting thing is going to be what changes that were caused by the pandemic really improved efficiency, or said those rules were not as necessary as we thought they were. So I think communication tools are there. From training standpoints, Gaille, you said you do a lot of training. We're converting the face-to-face training as much as we possibly can to some kind of distance, and we're seeing that this is the new normal. Our customers are saying, if you only need to see me for hands-on for 4 days instead of 3 weeks, there is there's goodness in that. I can do other things. The other thing we're finding is that while people think online training is easy, it actually takes more resources than most people realize, because you have to have somebody there monitoring the chats, the questions that people are coming in. If you have 15 students, and Marwan, you were talking about digital evidence and things like that, well, you want to be able to make sure that the people are getting the same experience. So you have to set up examples, scenarios, exercises that are pretty good once you get them down face to face. Now when you have to send a box of something and say, take bag A out and do something with it, show it to me on your camera, then that takes a little bit more time. I think we're coming to the end here. I know, Tracy, you've got a hard stop. Is there any last thing you'd like to add to this, Tracy, as we're moving along, and we can kind of wrap that up?
Sure. I just encourage anybody that's facing similar challenges to, they're very welcome to get in touch with us. We've had a lot of people from a lot of agencies helping us with it. We're trying to capture the lessons that we've learned. So for the next phase, the phase after that potentially, or the next virus, that we're a little bit more prepared than we have been for this one. But all in all, considering we were mostly making up as we went along, it wasn't as bad as I thought. I'm fully expecting to have more to come, but we're entering next week into a period of rest for all the teams because we seem to have got over this first little hurdle. So the next time we'll be readier than we were.
Gaille, any thoughts to go along with that?
I certainly think that there'll be lots of lessons to be learned post this first phase, but it's certainly the case that we're now trying to think of creative ways to run practical lessons for students in all types of disciplines, not just anthropology, but certainly crime scene investigation. So that's an ongoing discussion with police forces and interested parties in how we keep the things that have been created from this, that are good and useful, and enhanced communication, and change our practices for the better. That is for sure.
Marwan.
Yeah, this actually brings me back to my training in my master's degree in Lausanne, Switzerland, where we had a semester of working with real evidence. So it would be real saliva, real blood, biological evidence that today I would not be sure that I would want to touch this envelope or this stamp, or have it work with it in the lab. And it would also bring me back to my PhD, where I used crime scene case, so samples, crime scene type samples, such as blood stains, saliva stains. Again, I remember we had to be hepatitis vaccinated, but now there's a different degree of safety measures that I'm sure could be implemented. I don't want to sound negative with regards to online training. I'm very much pro online training, and this is a good opportunity for the forensic science community to be creative, to develop this, and I think that this would open towards the international community, the same way we're having this meeting right now.
Well, I can tell you that if being from an academic institution where it's uncertain when the students will return to campus, it's not just forensic science training, it's almost all training online, and therefore those of us with experience and who have the background are going to have to be very innovative at this time to make sure that the educational outcomes are as rich as they need to be to build the next round of forensic scientists. And you're going to have to be innovative in that if you're social distancing, that means you're going to have labs that are not just Monday, Wednesday, Friday, but Monday through Sunday, different times in the day, requiring additional resources. And we've all talked about resources are tough right now. We're in an economic situation where those resources may not be readily available, but we still have a job to do and we have a profession to support. So we're trying to work with folks like Tracy, Gaille, and Marwan to figure out how we're going to do this into the future. And it's quite interesting. We've done some innovative ways of having people run advanced analytical equipment remotely. So you have to have somebody there at the machine, the instrument, to put the samples on, but you can turn over the rest of the control to somebody else. So short of them being able to put a sample in a vial or a 96 well plate, they can run and control the analytical equipment and evaluate the data. So you have to look and see how you do the basic and then the intermediate and then the advanced training. So that's kind of where we're going. I think it's important that we continue to have discussions like we had on this webinar I agree with Tracy that if anybody has any questions, they should be able to reach out to any of us, and we'll try to get back to you in between our Zoom meetings and team calls and other things. I know I get exhausted after 6 hours a day of some type of video presentation, and there's some interesting research being done on that. So with that, I think that's really where we're at the end of our webinar, and I thank you all for joining and helping us.
Thank you.